Thank you very much. Today, a global challenge that is really capturing the public imagination is that of income disparity and inequality in the world. Now, while there's a widening recognition that inclusive growth is needed, I believe there's a deeply divergent views on exactly what constitutes inclusive growth. And a lot of the narratives on inclusive growth, unfortunately, at least for me, tend to come with a lot of ideological baggage. And at the risk of oversimplifying, on one end of the spectrum, you have the more sort of left-leaning crowd who point their fingers at Wall Street and perhaps even at capitalism itself as having failed. So for these folks, inclusive growth is all about more aggressive government interventions, including punitive taxation on the rich and direct income redistribution and so on. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people more of the, let's say, libertarian persuasion, who instead point their fingers at inept governments, counterproductive and anti-market policies being the culprit. And so for these folks, inclusive growth is all about re-injecting dynamism back into the economy such that social and economic mobility can improve. Now, such polarization is never very useful, and in the extremes, I would argue they're both misguided and misleading. So I hope to share with you a very different narrative on inclusive growth today, one that's based on some very exciting new research on economic complexity that's led by Ricardo Hausmann and his team at the Center for International Development at Harvard University. Now, from that perspective, and if you can put aside ideological blinders for the moment, upon closer examination, the situation of income disparity and inequality actually turns out to be a lot more nuanced, and it's a bit of a puzzle. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, which compares the richest with the poorest country in the world in terms of per capita GDP, first in 1870, again 2010. In 1870, the richest country is about 10 times richer than the poorest. And 140 years later, that ratio has gone up to over 100, with the US replacing the UK as being the richest country. So based on the left-hand side of the chart, you would have thought, well, the global economy has gone to the dogs. But then the right-hand side of the chart tells a very different story, a story of massive reduction in global poverty. Now, the World Bank defines poverty as somebody living on $3 per day or less. Using that definition, back in 1960, half the population in the world lived in poverty. And half a century later, it's down to 5%. It's a tremendous achievement. In fact, Angus Deaton, who was a Nobel laureate in economics last year, actually referred to this extraordinary phenomenon as the Great Escape. More people have been lifted out of poverty in the last half a century than ever before in recorded history. So what's going on? How is it that we can have simultaneously a widening of the gap between the richest and the poorest and a closing of that gap with hundreds of millions of people escaping poverty? Well, I think fundamentally we're still struggling with a better understanding of the dynamics on the ground that affects growth and productivity. And I think the key to a better understanding has to be found at the more individual, grassroots level. After all, at the end of the day, how productive we are individually affects how productive we can be as a society. So through the lens of economic complexity, it turns out that our individual productivity has to do with how well or poorly we are organized into networks of complementary inputs. Now, let me illustrate this with two very different individuals. On the left-hand side, we have an Inuit person fishing in the Arctic. Now, when you stop for a minute to think about it, he's incredibly skillful. Okay, the kind of things he can do with very limited tools in an isolated environment is just breathtaking. Then we have our fellow on the right. I'm sure we all know somebody that looks just exactly like him. And if we were to put him in Arctic-proof clothing and leave him there on his own, the chances are he won't survive very long at all. Then the question is, how is it that our fellow on the right can enjoy a standard of living so many orders of magnitude higher than the clearly far more skillful person on the left? Well, it turns out, through the lens of economic complexity, in modern economic production, our productivity is very rarely determined by our skills individually, taken on a standalone basis. It's actually affected how well or poorly our skills being connected to other complementary skills. Our fellow on the right actually is very well connected from that point of view. So he's arguably much narrower and shallower skills can become extraordinarily productive, whereas our far more skillful person on the left is very isolated. That explains the difference. And so that's the first critical feature of modern economic production. Okay, our productivity really has very little to do with how skillful we are, but much more so in terms of connectivity, networks of complementary input. Now that in turn is related to a second critical feature in modern economic production. Some of you may recognize the person on the left, Neil Ferguson, arguably one of the most famous public intellectuals today, a leading historian. In one of his recent works, he talked about, he's made a case that the rise of emerging markets today is unstoppable because of the internet, because emerging markets now can download everything that they need to know to drive the economic growth. And he compares this very favorably with the experiences of the previous industrial revolution when the spread of knowledge was very slow, making countries that got left behind very, very difficult to catch up with the leading countries. So in his inimitable fashion, he calls this the killer app of economic development. I think he's wrong. I think he's confused knowledge with know-how. Codified knowledge, information, instruction manuals, computer codes, and so on can indeed be downloaded quickly, instantaneously from the internet, free of charge or at very low cost. But that's only part of the equation. The more important part of it is know-how. Know-how is everything that we know how to do that we cannot explain. I think earlier you just heard the example of drinking water. We all know how to drink it. It took some research to understand how we do it. Skiing is know-how. The only way you can learn how to ski is to step into a pair of skis and start practicing. It's useful to have a ski instructor, especially if she's very good, but however experienced she is, she cannot download her skills directly onto the beginner skiers. At the end of the day, it's hours and hours practice before you can acquire that ability. So there's no killer app in skiing, just as there's no killer app in economic development. And incidentally, that explains why business travel has continued to grow in double-digit terms in the last 30 years. Some of you are old enough to remember in the beginning of the internet, people have been predicting, ever since the beginning, been predicting the imminent demise of business travel. Because now if you can share information across the internet, why do you need to bring people together to share information? Well, last year, global companies collectively spent about 1.5 trillion US dollars on business travel, about 2% of global GDP. And it's very expensive, business travel, and trust me, it's no fun. But there's no substitute for it, because business travel is not just sharing information, but bringing together know-how, constructing networks of complementary inputs in terms of know-how. That's a really important second feature of modern economic production. So let me just illustrate all this with two concrete real-life examples. Oh, okay, here we go. Networks of complementary inputs and know-how are critical enablers for raising productivity. The first example I want you to imagine, one of the best brain surgeons in the world, working in London, England, and then she decides for lifestyle reasons to take 6 months off to work as a volunteer in a rural health clinic in Nigeria. In so doing, I would argue her productivity plunges from being one of the best brain surgeons in the world to way below that of a general practitioner. Her productivity in London as a brain surgeon comes from her connection to very powerful networks of complementary input. Her operating room itself comprises of powerful networks of state-of-the-art apparatus, instrumentations, tools, and so on, all operated with a team of specialists. Before the operation is the laboratory services, diagnostic equipment, and pathologists, and so on. Post-operations, the ICU, and yet another network of specialists. That's why she can be so productive, because she's connected to these powerful networks. When she's cut off from all these networks, she's down to a basic GP or less in rural Nigeria. Same individual, her skills unchanged, but her productivity has plunged. The second example is that imagine a fruit farm in rural Kenya, up to yesterday, sold its produce in a local market in a town 20 kilometers away. Operation very simple. They load up the fruit, put on the local bus that trundled along at 15 kilometers an hour 20 kilometers away to this town, unloaded in the market, sold it, took the money, came home. It's profitable, but it's barely so. It's not expanding. And today, this fruit farm begins to sell its fresh produce in the desert city of Dubai, which has to import all its fresh produce. Adjusted for all the incremental cost on a per item sold basis, the productivity of this fruit farm has now increased 20 times, 2,000%. But to achieve that, it has to get connected to very powerful networks of complementary inputs. The local bus will not do. Dedicated trucking service is required, and refrigeration services required in the process to keep the products fresh with specialized packaging that protect it from bruising, and the freight logistics that follows, because now the fruit farm is involved in exporting. It requires financial services in terms of trade credit and export loans and so on, and is now moving fresh produce across international borders. It has to meet certain sanitation, disease control standards, highly specialized know-how is required. Once it's got to Dubai, it has to get plugged into the local retail distribution network and so on. And tomorrow, it aspires to sell in Europe. If successful, the return is not 20 times, it's 30 to 35 times higher. Europeans are paying a lot more, but the European Commission has its own much tighter standard for sanitation and disease control, so the fruit farm has yet to consult and engage even more sophisticated know-how to meet the standard. Same fruits, same fruit farm, that has not changed, but its productivity, big time, surged because of this connection to such vital networks. Now let me quickly try to sum up. Through the lens of economic complexity, I think we can begin to understand a bit better the dynamics on the ground that affects growth and productivity. And we can also resolve the puzzle that I posed earlier. How is it simultaneously we can have a widening of the gap between the richest and the poorest, and a closing of that gap with hundreds of millions of people escaping poverty? I would argue the hundreds of millions of people that have successfully escaped poverty are exactly the same hundreds of millions of people who have successfully got connected to more efficient, more productive networks, complementary inputs. And so the productivity can start to rise. The opposite is a poverty trap. For a variety of reasons, hundreds of millions more people have been denied the access to such vital networks. So they're stuck at very low-level productivity production. And through the lens of economic complexity, then we can construe inclusive growth as a process of eliminating barriers of access to these vital networks, starting with basic infrastructure to essential services to sophisticated know-how. And therefore, inclusive growth operates simultaneously in two dimensions. First is part of economic development, which we all know very well. But more significantly, I believe, inclusive growth is also a process of democratizing productivity. Just as in political development, democracy is all about the right to participate in decision-making on issues that impinge on the public interest and public welfare and so on. In economic development, democracy is all about the rights to access these vital networks such that individuals are empowered to reach the full productive potential. And I think the implications are profound. At a macro level, therefore, inclusive growth in democratizing productivity is also democratizing opportunities for entrepreneurs. So inclusive growth can actually provide the most fertile environment for entrepreneurship to thrive. And at a micro level, I would urge entrepreneurs to think beyond their individual capabilities and expertise and know-how, but begin to understand and identify appropriate networks of complementary input, complementary abilities, skills, and know-how such that they can get connected to push the envelope in terms of productivity and creative innovations. Thank you very much.